Evan always considered himself a trusting husband. He believed in supporting Samantha's aspirations, no matter how sudden or unexpected they seemed. So when she announced her decision to take up Krav Maga, he didn't question it. "I just want to feel stronger, safer," she had said over dinner, her brown eyes gleaming with excitement. "Krav Maga is supposed to be empowering." He had smiled, squeezing her hand. "That sounds amazing. I think it's great that you're doing something for yourself." That was 3 months ago. At first, Evan admired her dedication. She spoke about techniques, drills, and endurance training. But soon, he started noticing little things that didn't add up. She never seemed sore after her training, never complained of bruises, despite how intense the workouts supposedly were. One evening, he had playfully asked her to show him a move. Samantha had laughed it off. "I don't think you'd make a good training dummy," she teased, pressing a kiss to his cheek. But the suspicions didn't stop there. Her gym bag never had that post-workout stench. No sweaty clothes, no damp towels. Instead, it smelled of her usual perfume. Then there was the erratic schedule. Some days she'd leave earlier than necessary. Other times she'd come home much later than expected. Evan tried to dismiss it. He didn't want to be that husband, the one who accused his wife of something without proof. But a gut feeling had settled deep inside him, gnawing away, whispering that something wasn't right. Then came the night that changed everything. Evan had finished work early and thought it would be a sweet gesture to surprise Samantha at the gym. He imagined walking in, watching her practice, and then taking her out for dinner. But when he stepped inside, scanning the room for her familiar ponytail, she was nowhere to be seen. Frowning, he approached the receptionist. "Excuse me, my wife, Samantha Hayes, should be in class right now. Could you tell me where they're training?" The young man behind the desk furrowed his brows, tapping at the computer. "Samantha Hayes?" He scanned the screen. "She's not on the list for tonight." Evan's stomach twisted. "That can't be right. She's been coming here 3 times a week." The receptionist shrugged. "Last time she attended was 2 weeks ago?" 2 weeks? His pulse quickened. Where the hell had she been going? Shaken, Evan stepped outside and leaned against his car. He pulled out his phone, hesitating for only a second before opening the location tracking app they had installed years ago. It was meant for emergencies. Wasn't this one? The screen loaded and his breath caught. Samantha wasn't at the gym. She was across town, at a small café. His fingers tightened around the phone. He didn't think. He just drove. When he arrived, he parked across the street and scanned the café through the large windows. It didn't take long to find her. Samantha sat at a corner table, smiling, laughing. And sitting across from her was a man, not just any man, Luke, her so-called Krav Maga trainer. But there was no training here, no workout gear, no talk of self-defense. Just her, leaning in close, her fingers brushing against his hand as she laughed at something he said. Evan's world shifted. She had been lying, not just about the classes but about everything, and now she was about to find out that her secrets were not as well protected as she thought. Evan's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. His heart pounded in his chest, a sickening mix of anger and disbelief churning inside him. He had trusted Samantha. He had believed in her, encouraged her, never once doubting her word. And yet here she was, sipping wine with another man, her laughter floating through the cafe's dimly lit interior like a melody meant for someone else. He took another deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't charge in there, not yet. A public confrontation would only make things worse. It would give her an easy way out, a chance to turn the situation against him. No, he needed to be smart about this. He needed proof. Stepping out of his car, he moved carefully, staying just outside the cafe's window view. He angled his phone, snapping a few more pictures of Samantha and Luke, their faces illuminated by candlelight. Every movement between them told a story, one of familiarity, of comfort. Samantha wasn't fidgeting like she sometimes did when she was nervous. She wasn't glancing at her watch or checking her phone. She was relaxed, at home. Evan's stomach twisted. How long had this been going on? He ducked into a nearby alley, pressing his back against the brick wall. He needed more than just photos, he needed to hear them. With a deep inhale, he forced his pulse to slow and pulled up the voice recorder on his phone. It was risky, but he had no other choice. Carefully, he walked back toward the cafe, stepping just close enough to hear bits of their conversation, through the slight crack in the open window. Luke's voice was smooth, casual. "So, does he suspect anything?" Samantha let out a breathy laugh. "No. Evan trusts me too much. He'd never think to question it." Evan clenched his jaw so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. Luke chuckled. "I have to admit, I thought we'd get caught weeks ago, but you've been good at keeping it up." Samantha swirled the wine in her glass, a smirk tugging at her lips. "I mean, it's not like I want to lie, it's just, Evan isn't exciting. He's predictable, reliable, and sometimes, that's not enough." Evan's breath hitched. "Not enough?" Luke leaned in. "And what about us? Where is this going?" Samantha exhaled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know yet. I just know I don't want this to stop." Evan pulled back, his vision swimming. He had heard enough. His world was shattering piece by piece, but he refused to be crushed under the weight of her deception. Steeling himself, he turned away from the café, his mind already forming a plan. That night, Evan sat in the darkness of their shared bedroom, his thoughts running in circles. Samantha had come home late again, slipping into bed with the same ease as always, completely unaware that her secret had been exposed. Lying beside her, Evan stared at the ceiling, feeling the distance between them like a canyon he could never cross. He had considered confronting her right away, demanding the truth while the evidence was still fresh in his mind. But what would that accomplish? She'd deny it, make excuses, gaslight him into thinking he was overreacting. No. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, he planned his next move. The following day, Evan called in sick to work. He spent hours gathering every bit of information he could: bank statements, phone records, old messages. He pieced together a timeline, trying to determine just how long Samantha had been betraying him. 3 months. 3 months of deception. 3 months of stolen moments, of whispered lies, of a marriage that had slowly become a farce. By the afternoon, he had everything he needed: the photos, the recordings, the undeniable proof. And that's when he made the call. "Hey Josh," Evan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I need a favor." Josh was Evan's oldest friend, someone who had known him long before Samantha had ever entered the picture. More importantly, he had connections. People who could make sure Samantha's lies didn't stay hidden for long. "I need you to help me expose someone," Evan continued. "I want the truth out in the open. No more hiding." Josh was silent for a moment before exhaling sharply. "Say no more. Just tell me what you need." Evan smirked. He wasn't going to just confront Samantha. He was going to make sure everyone knew. That night he prepared for the confrontation. He didn't want a private argument behind closed doors. No, Samantha had built her lies in the dark. It was only fair that the truth came to light in front of an audience. So he called their friends, their family. He invited them over for dinner. And Samantha, none the wiser, agreed. The house was full by the time Samantha arrived home. She hesitated in the doorway, her brows knitting together in confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, forcing a smile as she looked around at the familiar faces. Evan stood in the center of the room, his arms crossed over his chest. "I thought it was time we had a little honesty," he said. Samantha laughed nervously. "Honesty about what?" Evan pulled out his phone, pressing play on the recording. Luke's voice filled the air. "Does he suspect anything?" Samantha's breath hitched. Evan let it play. "Evan trusts me too much. He'd never think to question it." The room fell silent. Samantha's face drained of color. Evan lifted his gaze, meeting hers with a stare so cold it sent a shiver down her spine. "So," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "How's training going?" Samantha's world crumbled in an instant. Everything she had carefully constructed, every excuse, every lie, it all collapsed beneath the weight of Evan's proof. She stammered, looking around, searching for an escape. But there was none. Their friends were watching. Evan had taken away her ability to twist the truth. She had nothing left to defend herself with. And for the first time in their marriage, Samantha was the one left feeling powerless. Evan turned away, the weight on his chest lifting. He had given her everything: his love, his trust, his unwavering belief in their future, and she had thrown it away. But now he was done, and this time he was the one walking away. Evan stood at the center of the living room, his heart hammering inside his chest as he watched Samantha struggle to form words. The recording was still playing, the damning evidence reverberating through the space like an echo of the life she had chosen to destroy. The hushed whispers of their friends and family filled the air, a symphony of shock, betrayal, and growing realization. Samantha's mouth opened and closed, her face shifting from horror to denial and then desperation. It was as if her mind was scrambling to grasp a lifeline, a plausible explanation, anything that could turn this situation in her favor. But there was no escape. Not this time. Evan let the silence stretch, watching her squirm under the weight of it. He wanted her to feel the same suffocating helplessness he had felt when he had stood outside that café, watching her laugh with another man. Watching her betray him in real time while he sat there, blind and devoted, believing in the illusion of their marriage. Samantha finally found her voice, though it was weak, fragile, and cracking at the seams. "Evan, this isn't what you think it's not." Evan lifted a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his voice even, though every muscle in his body was tight with restrained emotion. "Don't insult my intelligence by trying to twist this into something it's not. We all heard you. We all see you." Samantha's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally. Her mother, seated in the corner, had her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her father refused to meet her gaze, shaking his head ever so slightly, his disappointment written in the deep creases of his face. Their closest friends, the people who had been there at their wedding, the ones who had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries with them, looked at her like she was a stranger, like they no longer recognized the woman standing before them. Luke was absent. He had never been invited. Evan had made sure of that. This was her reckoning. This was her burden to bear. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered finally, her voice breaking, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Evan tilted his head slightly, his gaze hard. "Didn't mean for what to happen, Samantha? Didn't mean to lie to me? Didn't mean to sneak around behind my back? Didn't mean to laugh about how predictable I was while you sat across from him, drinking wine like I didn't even exist?" Samantha flinched at his words, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her dress. "I was lost," she admitted, shaking her head. I don't know, Evan. I just felt like something was missing. I needed to feel something again." Evan let out a slow, measured breath. "And the only way to do that was to betray me?" His voice was low, cutting, slicing through her feeble justifications like a blade. "You could have talked to me, Samantha. You could have told me that something felt wrong, that you weren't happy, but instead you chose this. You chose to lie. You chose to deceive me. You chose to humiliate me." Tears slipped down her cheeks now, her defenses crumbling piece by piece. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. Evan's laugh was humorless, bitter. "You did hurt me," he said, his voice steel. "You knew what you were doing. Every time you left the house, every time you looked me in the eyes and told me you were going to class when you were actually meeting him, you knew exactly what you were doing." Samantha shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Evan, please, we can fix this. I love you." Evan took a step back, out of her reach, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. "You don't." Samantha let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth as more tears spilled down her face. "Evan, please," she whispered, her voice desperate now, raw. "Please don't do this. Please, I don't want to lose you." Evan let the words settle between them, heavy and hollow. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting, watching. He had the power now, the power to decide how this ended. He had spent so much time feeling powerless, drowning in doubt and suspicion, questioning his own sanity, wondering if he was imagining things, if he was just being paranoid. But he hadn't been paranoid, he had been right. And now he wasn't the one with something to lose. "You already lost me," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, resolute. "The moment you decided that this was worth more than what we had," Samantha sobbed, shaking her head, her shoulders trembling as the full weight of her actions settled onto her. Evan had never seen her look so small, so broken, but he felt nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just exhaustion. Turning away from her, he faced the people in the room, the people who had been there for both of them, The people who had just witnessed the complete unraveling of a marriage that had once seemed unshakable. He took a breath, steadying himself, then spoke with a calmness that startled even him. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady. "I'm sorry that this is how tonight turned out, but I needed you to know the truth. I needed you all to see it." There was a quiet murmur of agreement, nods of understanding. A few sympathetic glances were thrown Samantha's way, but the betrayal was too fresh, too glaring to ignore. Evan turned back to her one last time, his expression unreadable. "I'll be moving out first thing tomorrow," he said simply. "You can have the house, you can have the life you built on lies, but I won't be a part of it anymore." Samantha's sobs grew louder, but Evan had nothing left to give. He was done. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind the shattered remains of a marriage that had already fallen apart long before tonight. And as he stepped outside into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, filling his lungs with something he hadn't felt in months. Evan stood outside his house, the place he had once considered his sanctuary, the foundation of the life he had built with Samantha. But now, as he looked at it in the dim glow of the streetlights, it felt unfamiliar, like a hollow structure rather than a home. The walls no longer held warmth, the windows no longer invited comfort. It was just bricks and mortar, a place where trust had been shattered and love had turned into something unrecognizable. He took a slow, measured breath, his hands curled into fists at his sides, as he steeled himself for what came next. He had told Samantha he would be leaving the next morning, but the thought of spending another night under the same roof with her, of sharing the same air while knowing the depth of her betrayal, made his skin crawl. He had no intention of dragging this out, of making it easier for her to plead and beg and weave more lies in a last-ditch effort to salvage what she had so recklessly destroyed. He would not allow himself to be swayed by empty apologies or tears shed in regret. Regret was not enough. She had made her choices, and now she would live with the consequences. Pushing open the front door, he stepped inside, the quiet of the house pressing in on him like a weight. The lights were dim, and for a brief moment he wondered if Samantha had gone to bed, if she had curled up under the same blankets they had once shared, as if everything that had happened that night could be erased by sleep. But as he walked toward the living room, he found her sitting on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up at him the moment he entered, her face a mixture of exhaustion and raw desperation. "You came back," she whispered, as if the mere act of him stepping through the door meant that he had changed his mind, that there was still a chance. Evan didn't answer right away. He studied her, the way her shoulders trembled, the way her hands clutched the fabric of the oversized sweater she was wearing. He had seen her vulnerable before, during arguments, during difficult times, but never like this. And yet, he felt nothing, no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. She had made sure of that. "I came back to pack," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, each word deliberate, firm. "I meant what I said, Samantha. I'm leaving." She flinched as if the words physically hurt, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. For a moment she simply sat there, staring at him with wide, desperate eyes, searching for something, anything, that would convince him to stay. But there was nothing left to find. "Please," she finally croaked out, her voice shaking. "Can we just talk? Just for a minute?" Evan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He didn't want to talk. There was nothing she could say that would change the reality of what had happened. But part of him, the part that still clung to the remnants of the years they had spent together, allowed her this one last chance. "You have 1 minute," he said flatly, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorway. Samantha swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sweater. "I know I messed up," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you in a way I can't take back. But Evan, I never stopped loving you. Not for a second." Evan's jaw tightened. "You don't cheat on someone you love." She shook her head rapidly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It wasn't about love," she insisted. "It was about, I don't even know. I felt lost. I felt like I was disappearing, like I wasn't myself anymore. And Luke, he made me feel alive again. I know that sounds horrible and I hate myself for it, but it was never about him. It was about me. Evan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. So, that's supposed to make it better? That it was about you finding yourself while destroying us in the process? Samantha buried her face in her hands, sobbing into her palms. I don't expect you to forgive me, she choked out. I need you to know that it wasn't because you weren't enough. You were everything. You are everything. Evan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Maybe there was some truth in her words. Maybe she really had been lost, searching for something she couldn't even define. But that didn't erase what she had done. It didn't change the fact that while he had been loving her, trusting her, she had been lying to him, deceiving him with every kiss, every smile, every whispered, I love you. You made your choice, he said finally, his voice calm, controlled. And now, I'm making mine. Samantha let out a broken sob, but he didn't stay to hear the rest. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hall, his steps measured, steady. He entered their bedroom, the room they had once shared, the room where he had once felt safe, and pulled out the suitcases from the closet. He moved quickly, methodically, packing only what he needed. Clothes, toiletries, essentials. Everything else? It didn't matter. Not anymore. By the time he zipped up the last bag, Samantha was standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched him, her expression raw and pleading. Where will you go? She asked, her voice barely audible. Evan slung the bag over his shoulder, his gaze meeting hers one last time. Anywhere but here, and with that he walked past her, down the hall, through the front door. He stepped into the night, the air cool against his skin, crisp with the scent of autumn. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. Because for the first time in months, maybe even years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Evan drove through the city streets with no real destination in mind. The night stretched before him, open and uncertain, much like the future he now faced. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across his dashboard as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles still tight with the tension of the evening. The echoes of Samantha's broken sobs still rang in his ears, but they did not sway him. He had made his decision, and for the first time in a long while he felt no need to question it. There was no regret, no hesitation, only a deep, quiet certainty that leaving was the only choice that made sense. He pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel, one of those places that looked as if it hadn't changed in decades, with its neon vacancy sign buzzing softly in the cool night air. It wasn't home, but for now it was enough. He checked in without much thought, the tired-looking clerk barely glancing up as he handed over a key. The room was nothing special, just a bed, a nightstand, and a small television bolted to the wall. But at least it was his for the night. Evan dropped his bag by the door, sitting on the edge of the bed, exhaling a slow breath as the weight of the past few days settled on his shoulders. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen before finally unlocking it. There were messages, missed calls, most from Samantha, a few from mutual friends who had likely heard what happened. He ignored them all. He wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Instead, he opened a new message thread and typed two simple words. I left. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The message was for Josh, the friend who had stood by him through it all, the one person he could count on to understand without judgment. Minutes later, his phone vibrated. Good, about time. That was all Josh said, but it was enough. Evan let his phone drop onto the nightstand, leaning back against the pillows. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but simply to breathe, to exist in this new, unfamiliar space that was no longer defined by Samantha's lies or the marriage that had slowly eroded into something unrecognizable. The next morning, Evan woke to a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in months. There was no rush to be anywhere, no need to pretend. He took his time showering, letting the hot water wash away the remnants of a life he had left behind. When he finally stepped out of the motel, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and pink. He stood there for a long moment, taking it in, feeling the crisp morning air fill his lungs. He had no idea what came next, but for the first time in a long while that uncertainty didn't scare him. He drove to a nearby diner, one of those quiet little places where no one asked questions, where the coffee was strong and the waitresses called you hun without a second thought. He slid into a booth, nodding his thanks as a steaming cup of coffee was placed in front of him. As he stared at the dark liquid, he thought about everything that had brought him here. He thought about the moment he first suspected Samantha was lying, the uneasy feeling that had curled in his stomach every time she left for her so-called self-defense classes. He thought about the night at the café, the way she had laughed so freely with Luke, completely unaware that her world was about to crumble. He thought about the confrontation, the way she had begged, pleaded, tried to twist the narrative to make herself the victim. But most of all, he thought about the freedom he felt now, the weight that had lifted from his chest the moment he walked out of that house for good. He was done mourning a marriage that had ended long before he had realized. He was done clinging to a life that was built on deception. It was time to move forward, to rebuild, to rediscover who he was beyond the role of a betrayed husband. By the time he finished his coffee, Evan had made up his mind. He wasn't going back. Not to the house, not to the memories, not to Samantha's desperate attempts at redemption. He had spent too long fighting for a love that no longer existed, and now he was finally ready to fight for himself. He pulled out his phone, scrolling past Samantha's messages without a second glance, instead opening a new browser window. Apartments for rent, jobs in new cities, fresh starts. The possibilities stretched before him, endless and waiting. For the first time in a long while, Evan allowed himself to smile. He didn't know where the road would take him next, but one thing was certain: it was finally his journey to take, on his own terms, at his own pace, and that was more than enough. Nathan sat in the quiet of his now empty home, the air around him thick with the kind of silence that only comes after something irrevocable has ended. The suitcase was gone, Olivia was gone, and with her, the carefully spun illusion she had spent months crafting. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face as if that simple motion could wipe away the lingering weight pressing against his chest. He had done what needed to be done, there was no question about that. Yet even in victory there was no rush of satisfaction, no triumphant relief. There was only the slow, steady unraveling of a life he had once believed in, thread by painful thread. He stood and walked to the kitchen, reaching for the bottle of whiskey he kept on the top shelf. The irony wasn't lost on him. Olivia had spent months pretending to be enamored with fine wines, swirling them in delicate glasses while sitting across from another man, whispering things Nathan would never know. Now, he poured himself a drink that burned on the way down, something that tasted of finality rather than pretense. He leaned against the counter, staring at nothing in particular, his mind drifting between the past and the uncertain stretch of the future that lay ahead. He had spent so long trying to be the husband Olivia deserved, never realizing that the woman he loved had already checked out, had already decided that their marriage was nothing more than a comfortable arrangement she could discard when it no longer suited her. His phone vibrated on the counter beside him. For a split second he thought about ignoring it, but the name flashing on the screen made his decision for him. Mark. He sighed, picking up the call and pressing the phone to his ear. "How you holding up?" Mark's voice was even, but there was a cautious edge to it, the kind of careful concern that came from knowing a friend well enough to understand that the worst wounds weren't always the ones people could see. Nathan let out a breath, swirling the whiskey in his glass before taking another sip. "I'm still standing, if that's what you're asking." Mark was silent for a moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, well, after the way you handled things, I figured you would be. You really sent her packing, huh?" Nathan smirked slightly, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. It was overdue. "You hear about Adrian?" Mark asked, and there was something in his tone that told Nathan he was going to enjoy whatever came next. Nathan tilted his head slightly. "No, but I'm guessing you're about to fill me in." Mark let out a short laugh. "Let's just say the wine community isn't exactly rallying around their beloved sommelier. Word spread fast. Turns out people don't take too kindly to a guy who uses his credentials to seduce married women. The tasting room ran a piece this morning, not an exposé or anything, but a little nudge in the right direction. They mentioned unprofessional conduct and a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Sounds like a few women finally came forward with their own stories about him too. Nathan exhaled slowly, letting the information settle. He had expected fallout, had counted on it, but hearing it confirmed brought a quiet sort of justice. So, he's finished, pretty much. Not officially, but his reputation took a serious hit. Won't be booking any exclusive events anytime soon. Nathan nodded, satisfied. Good. Mark hesitated for a second, then said, And Olivia? Nathan's grip tightened around the glass, but his voice remained calm. She signed the papers. Mark let out a low whistle. Damn, that was fast. She knew she didn't have a choice, Nathan said simply. Dragging it out wouldn't have changed anything. She got caught. There was nothing left to salvage. Another beat of silence passed before Mark spoke again, his voice quieter now. And you? What now? Nathan stared into the amber liquid in his glass, the golden hue reflecting the light above the counter. That was the question, wasn't it? What now? For so long his life had been mapped out, predictable, stable. Now that stability had been ripped away, replaced by something else entirely. Something unknown, something that stretched ahead of him like an open road with no signs to follow. He could be angry, could let the betrayal eat away at him, but what would that accomplish? He had already spent enough time being deceived. He wasn't going to waste any more of his life dwelling on it. I move on, he finally said. I start over. Mark was quiet for a second before he spoke, his voice lighter this time. Well, in that case, I think the first step in your fresh start should be meeting me at O'Malley's tonight. No point drinking alone, man. Nathan let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. You really think a bar is the best place to celebrate the end of my marriage? Not celebrating, Mark corrected, just a drink, a toast to new beginnings. And if a beautiful woman happens to strike up a conversation with you, well, that's just a bonus. Nathan rolled his eyes but found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like days. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe tonight wasn't about drowning in the past, but about acknowledging that the future was still his to shape. He glanced at the empty suitcases Olivia had taken with her. Now just a memory rather than a weight. Fine, he said. O'Malley's it is. First round's on you. Mark laughed. You got it, man. See you in an hour. Nathan hung up the phone and set his empty glass down on the counter. He took one last look around the house. The same house that had once been filled with a lie, now empty, but also full of possibilities. He grabbed his keys, exhaled slowly, and stepped out the door. It was time to move forward.